Hello, everyone, and today we're going to be reviewing and resuming our readings of Belonging Again II.1, and we're at section 3 of chapter 1, which is titled, How Do We Assume Everyone is Persuadable Without Totalitarianism? And we've already discussed this question of how does anyone leave Plato's cave on their own, which is a very weird question. When you go back and read the text, you see that people are dragged out of the cave, which is very different from how we usually remember the text. Usually we have this image of someone standing up and leaving on their own, but really in the text what we see is an individual being dragged out, which is a very different structure. So that leaves a hanging question. How does anyone leave Plato's cave on their own? We also discussed the deconstruction of bestocentricism that we see in Nietzsche when we go through the gay science. But then, of course, that begs the question, how does anyone change or do something different without being forced, without it being bestowed to them? How do people become? How do people engage in their own transformation? A way to think about it is the question of intrinsic motivation. How does anyone gain intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic motivation? And we've tied this to the question of spreading childhood, which is based on Nietzsche, as being necessary today for belonging again without regressing into previous forms of belonging that were problematic and led to various pathologies that could be very bad. And here we're going to frame the question in a way that was inspired by Justin Murphy at Other Life. We had a discussion on the Republic, and he brought really to the forefront a fascinating episode in Plato, which starts off the Republic that I think might actually frame the whole thing. And if we take it seriously, we might be more sympathetic toward what seems to be a totalitarian vision in the Republic, following like a Call Piper, and someone like a Jonathan Rauch, Call Popper. I said Piper. Well, maybe he plays flute, or did, or something like that. But it's interesting. Also, this is in celebration of the upcoming Parallax Course that will be starting on Sunday, July 7th. We're very excited to have a chance to go back over there. Andrew and Tom do wonderful work, and we're very excited to have the chance to teach again over there, and it's going to be about belonging again. So you can find a link, you can find a link in the description. You can also go to parallax.com and find it there. And so we will be again reading from chapter 1, section 3, Belonging Again II.1. Like the questions of how does anyone leave Plato's cave on their own and how might people be children, another question arises that gets at the same problem, but from a different angle. And it arises at the very start of the Republic, as was brought to my attention by Justin Murphy. I've had the pleasure of being part of the Other Life community since 2019, and Mr. Murphy began organizing regular readings of the great books in 2023, which I've enjoyed immensely. On October 9th, 2023, we discussed Plato's Republic, and Mr. Murphy drew attention to the fascinating start of the book, where Socrates and Glaucon are going down to the Piraeus with Glaucon to pray to the goddess. Suddenly, the slave boy of Polemarchus grabs the cloak of Socrates and orders him to wait for Polemarchus. They do, and Polemarchus acknowledges that Socrates and Glaucon are in a hurry to get away to town, but then basically says that they have no choice but to stay because Polemarchus and his men are stronger than them. Either prove stronger than these men or stay here, the book says. It's a strange way to start the Republic, as Justin emphasizes. And I think Mr. Murphy is right to draw attention to it, for it might be a way to frame everything that follows. Socrates replies to Polemarchus that there might be one other possibility, our persuading you that you must let us go. And Polemarchus replies with an answer that might help us understand Plato's whole Republic. Could you really persuade if we don't listen? This is a staggering reply, for it suggests that all of philosophy is helpless if we don't care. And this logic applies just as well to democracy, reasoning, and conversation in general, suggesting how powerless ideas and philosophy ultimately are, while at the same time seeming incredibly powerful, considering the warnings of Thomas Sowell and Paul Johnson on the intellectual class. Glaucon acknowledges that they are helpless if Polemarchus won't listen, and Polemarchus tells them to think it over, bearing in mind we won't listen, as if he is presenting the ultimate undefeatable argument. But what's there to think? Philosophy is powerless. End of story. But then quickly, Odymus brings up how at sunset there will be a torch race on horseback for the goddess. It makes it seem like Socrates and Glaucon are being given a great invitation, for which they accept. Gratefully, that's left ambiguous. But what is the point of this starting episode if ultimately Socrates and Glaucon are going to so quickly move on? I think it's to immediately highlight that philosophy is weak, which we should keep in mind if we see in the Republic a totalitarian regime, as suggested by Karl Popper. Indeed, there is an argument to be made that Plato offers a nightmare. But what if instead Plato is helping us think through something difficult? Mainly, what can we do if people refuse to be persuadable? Well, nothing. So we find ourselves faced with a question that the Republic might exist to address. How do we make sure that people are always persuadable? So the Republic starts with, again, to review, Socrates and Glaucon, they're going somewhere, and a guy comes along and says, you must come with me and have a great philosophical discussion. And they're like, well, what if we don't want to? The guy's like, well, I'm stronger than you, so I can force it. And then Socrates is like, well, wait a minute. What if we were to persuade you to let us go? And he's like, well, I just won't listen. And it's so interesting because it suggests that philosophy is really powerless, which then, of course, is very odd to open the Republic, because philosophy seems to be suggested to be extremely powerful with the philosopher king. And then, of course, there's the whole history of 20th century ideologies and all that other stuff that seems to suggest that ideas really matter. I think it's Richard Weaver who says ideas have consequences. And so it's quite odd. There's this one way in which philosophy seems extremely powerful, and yet the Republic starts seemingly suggesting that philosophy is very weak. So that's quite odd. To resume, the world today seems filled with illiberalism that cannot be reasoned with. People who are certain they are right, and so there is nothing to discuss. Belonging Again, Part 1 discussed regularly the trouble with the banality of evil, which is Hannah Arendt, and closed-mindedness, as it also discussed the trouble with those who are rebelling against the system in the name of justice, freedom, and so on. Once people become like this, what can philosophy do? Nothing, perhaps. The owl of Nineveh can fly off. Indeed, looking around, what can philosophy say? It often feels like it can't do anything. And perhaps what Plato is suggesting is that once the world becomes unreasonable and illiberal, it's too late. The game is over. If that's true, though, can we really so quickly condemn the totalitarianism of the Republic? Perhaps the issue is just that Plato takes the problem more seriously than us, more of a realist. Once a people become unpersuadable and closed to philosophical inquiry, we seem doomed. Can we really say that Plato is oppressive to work to create a republic where it's impossible for people to become unpersuadable? Would justice have us do any other way, given that it seems to be too late once people become unpersuadable? Westerners may speak of freedom and wanting to defend it, but are we so sure of freedom if it means people use it to become fascists, radicals, terrorists, and so on? We might continue to verbally support freedom when directly asked, but bit by bit, we might start supporting the removal of a little freedom here, a little freedom there, and step by step, we might approach Plato's vision in the name of justice. And please note, this isn't necessarily bad. After all, as Belonging Again Part 1 discusses, it is precisely in the name of values and justice that we can work against the conditions that make belonging and society possible. How else should we act? This suggests the value circle and conflict of society, central notions that pointed out the essential incompleteness of society, Gödel-esque, and perhaps what we see in Plato is an effort to create a society that isn't essentially incomplete. Unfortunately, that seems to require force and totalitarianism, and furthermore, Plato doesn't seem to have a good answer for how someone might leave Plato's cave on their own. But are we any better? At this point in history, I don't think so. A realization that we could call Plato's challenge that, in a way, all of Belonging Again is dedicated to addressing. Philosophy can be about anything and anybody. So if there is a way to make everyone persuadable, which is to make it so that there is always hope for discussion, democracy, conversation, philosophy is likely a good candidate. Though at the same time, philosophy can cause a mass spreading of autonomous rationality, which is self-effacing, exactly as Samuel Barnes warns in the Iconoclast. But after the loss of Gibbons, we're all philosophical now. The risk cannot be avoided. Furthermore, Plato tells us that philosophy is not about being a lover of opinion, but someone who delights in each thing that is itself. And a corollary to being a philosopher would seem to be that a person is persuadable. For how else could we move from opinion to what things actually are, if not through persuadability? It's unclear to me if Plato himself hopes to spread philosophy to the masses, though it's clear that at least the best philosophers are rare for him and should be rulers and kings. Regardless, Plato's thoughts, though, we might inquire into that possibility ourselves, for it will be for us to consider if we might spread childhood, which is a major concern of belonging again. The Republic could be approached to help us inquire into the conditions which would make everyone in a society philosophical enough to be changed. If the vision of Plato is totalitarian, it might be totalitarian precisely to prevent the unstoppable power of refusing to listen from being employed by the citizenship. Plato might be trying to stop an unstoppable force with an unmovable object, an effort that might not seem so forceful and oppressive if we see it as a way to stop people from ever becoming unpersuadable, a point at which only force seems like it could change people, a failure which we might be suffering ourselves this very day, hence why what Daniel Smackenberg calls the meta-crisis is such an issue. Plato starts off the Republic with the Socrates who knows he knows nothing, also proving himself to be incredibly weak. A philosopher king might be a weak king, perhaps even Christ-like, the love of wisdom, weakness, unless alternatively a philosophical and dictatorial suffering servant as described with David Hume in The Absolute Choice, which is perhaps our only hope where people aren't persuadable. We could say that one of the great accomplishments of the modern world is that we have generally made people forget how weak ideas actually are, for we have been so cultured and civilized that this doesn't even occur to us, though perhaps today that is through disablement, as Illich describes, which poses a problem. But this means we never addressed the weakness of ideas, only stopped thinking about it, while at the same time convincing ourselves that we figured out how to make ideas strong through schooling, education, college. Very similar to how we never figured out how to leave Plato's cave on our own, only convinced ourselves we did. If, as Plato and Socrates suggest, that ultimately the choice is between persuasion or force, this means we have left unaddressed a weak point in our modern world that force could find and break back in through, causing great horror, ergo the meta-crisis. If force does so, what could we do? Persuade it to stop? But it's not persuadable, as aren't we. Polemarchus smiles, land waits. How do we empower weak ideas against force without closed-mindedness in a world where people problematically associate making our ideas strong with becoming unpersuadable, threatening pluralism? So that's important because a lot of people, they think about keeping their ideas strong by just not being open to evidence, so becoming unpersuadable. What's here, funny enough, the suggestion is that philosophy only works if people are persuadable. So there's a way there in which you can say that the way that people make ideas strong is precisely to become unphilosophical, which is a major problem. To resume, might we deal with this with education? Yes, but a very particular kind of education, mainly one that makes people persuadable, enabled versus disabled. So that a bold there is italicized. Critically, a persuadable society is not the same as a persuading society, or even necessarily a society of persuasion. There are distinctions here that need to be maintained, especially in a world where persuasion and manipulation are emotionally and mentally conflated, which is a huge problem. A persuadable society, meaning a society that is able to persuade, to be persuaded, which is to say has that ability and entails those conditions of possibility, is qualitatively different than a society that doesn't have this ability, which means it will also have different kinds of subjects, ways of living, a phrase which must suggest persuadability, perhaps the deepest philosophical ability. A persuadable society is an open society, to allude to Karl Popper, and where there are no openings, there is no possibility of a river hole, as we'll explain. However, by open society here, we mean something different and deeper than merely a society where people can express their differences freely, though that's necessary. Rather, we mean a society where it's possible for people to be changed by a movement of reason, not stuck in understanding. Popper was no fan of Hegel, hurting him. Persuadability is the condition of possibility for reason, with a capital R, and we mean it in the Hegelian sense. It is the only possibility of an experience of thought working and moving outside ourselves that we are invited to join, a communal act suggesting hope. We oddly live in a world that stresses education and claims ideas matter while not creating the conditions of persuadability, without which perhaps no other conditions of possibility are possible, without violence at least. In fact, persuasion can be reviled, and we are told we should stand for what we believe. We fail to realize flexibility can be a strength, as can be humility. But persuadability is something we must be able to do if we are to avoid force and violence, suggesting why it is also dangerous to treat words as the same kind of violence as a gunshot. And ultimately, persuadability is a skill possible in and through the work of Hegel and psychoanalysis, like we see in Lacan. If we become persuadable but cannot stay such because of the real, we are still at great risk. This will require voicecraft and word spread, an education not of trivia, but of psychoanalytical persuadability, without which the conditions of possibility for the movability of reason will not be possible at scale, for we will prove incapable of freeing speech, but must manage the real. We must manage the real, 1,000 ways. But wait, didn't we say with Nietzsche and bestocentrism that most people are bestowed their values and ideas from something external to them? Doesn't that suggest the world is extremely persuadable? An excellent point. And I should note that the radical similarity of bestowing and persuading is one of the reasons why bestocentrism is so problematic. The hardest problems tend to be those isomorphic to an address. Bestowing is generally more thoughtless and tends to reify the good and evil dichotomy of Nietzsche, while persuadability, as an ability, is active and leads to a choice of value, noble versus contemptible. That's the Nietzsche distinction. In bestowing, I receive, recite, replicate, and so on, withholding active judgment, while in persuadability, I still receive and take in, but ultimately I have to make a decision on what I receive and what I am told. Bestowing mimics, while proving oneself persuadable, means we can hold ourselves as a space of dwelling, that's an Illic phrase, and gathering, suspending judgment versus just automatically assenting to or discrediting what we experience externally. In bestowing, there is little practical difference between us and the outer world, while in persuadability, I prove able to suspend the outer world and capable of making myself a clearing to hold multiple possibilities, with all the tension and anxiety such brings, until it is time for me to make a judgment and decision, which cannot happen well if I cannot hold the options in and with myself for long. In bestocentrism, we can come to think we don't need to be such a clearing, that's a Heideggerian term, but we can be habituated to think that if we need to know something, we would have been told it. And furthermore, we wouldn't have been told what we were if it wasn't something we should believe. Alternatively, to be persuadable is to work against autonomous bestowing in favor of becoming, for we seemingly can only become if we have been enabled with persuadability. Otherwise, we cannot develop. And please note that persuadability is not exclusively a matter between people, because life itself can prove persuading, inspiring, or the like. Persuadability and openness are profoundly connected, and where education bestows versus enables us with persuadability, we can paradoxically end up less persuadable and more closed, even if education regularly claims that it is about opening our minds. We are perhaps even likely, under these conditions, to conflate willingness to learn with willingness to be persuaded, and yet teachability is not necessarily persuadability, because we might only be teachable within our ideology and worldview, our persuasion per se. Just because we are willing to learn new things and be given or to take a position on something doesn't necessarily mean we are willing to suspend, adapt, change, or expand a pre-existing position. Mounting a ladder, hovering motionlessly on one, or collecting ladder rungs, alluding to Schopenhauer, are not the same as climbing a ladder, switching ladders, or moving the ladder to lean against a different building. If we're afraid of moving, we cannot climb. If we're incapable of changing positions, we might be incapable of developing positions. And can such positions live? Taking a position, changing a position, and developing a position have all been conflated today, which can make us think we are persuadable when we are only teachable, which is like how we can think we are free when we are only draggable. We can think of ourselves as free when we are yet to be, or when we only might be, and that might leave wide an opening for force. But do we have any idea how we might scale the conditions of possibility for persuadability, for the majority to leave the cave without being dragged? Directly, at least, Plato might not be able to help us think through this problem, the conditions in which people might on their own choose to leave the cave, which would require persuadability by others or oneself to oneself. That meta-architecture is our goal, and those would be the conditions that would help assure everyone is persuadable without being totalitarian, which are also the conditions by which we can spread childhood. Plato can then be seen as presenting us with a challenge. Though we might critique him for being oppressive, he might gaze back at us with Socrates and ask, is your way really better? As of 2023, can we really respond with a strong yes? That's the end of section 3 of chapter 1. And it's really, again, to review, it's really looking at this issue where Plato starts the Republic with this very odd episode, as Justin Murphy brings out, where Socrates and Glaucon are suddenly confronted with, they're going somewhere, someone stronger than them comes along and says, come with me, I want to have a philosophical discussion. And they're like, no, we don't want to go. And they're like, well, you have to because we're stronger than you. And Socrates is like, well, what if we could persuade you? And he goes, well, what if we're not persuadable? Then we get our way, right? And what's interesting about that is that also it suggests a few things. It suggests ideas are weak. Like if people don't listen to ideas, then they don't matter. Then what can you do? Which again is odd because at the same time, ideas change the world. Like again, Paul Johnson, Thomas, Dr. Sowell, other people, they talk all the time about how ideas change the world. And some people writing some book somewhere can change everything. So there's this double move where ideas seem weak and yet they also seem very powerful. And that would also suggest why, sociology will talk about, various sociologists will talk about the move from the warrior class to the clergy class, to the scholarship class. And it seems like those are the things that kind of have to happen, where you move to the clerical class, where ideas are very powerful if you're going to, in fact, have ideas have authority. So there has to be a kind of movement that occurs in that. Otherwise, ideas don't seem very powerful. And so then if that's the case, we might understand why Socrates creates a society that basically forces people to acknowledge ideas or forces people with ideas to lead. Because otherwise the incentive structure, just simply because people like being right, they don't like changing their minds, well, the incentive structure might make it to where there's incentive not to care about ideas, or to use power over ideas, or to ignore ideas. And once those incentive structures arise and people just refuse to listen to ideas, how can you fix it? How can you fix the system? And so again, if there's a certain oppression going on in Plato, we might, Plato might look at us and be like, well, do you have a better idea? Because, how are you going to make sure that people stay persuadable to listen to ideas? And the other key point of that section is that persuadability is an ability. It is not easy to change your views or to listen to new ideas. That's going to take an ability, a capacity. And I think we can align it with a psychoanalytical capacity to handle the real, or to handle the surprising, or to handle the deconstruction of your symbolic, or the thwarting of your imaginary registrar. This is very difficult. So it's an ability. And problematically today, we can think of persuasion, being persuaded, as a kind of weakness. Oh man, you must be weak if someone could change your mind. When really, to be able to change your mind or to follow ideas is an ability. It's a capacity. It is not necessarily something people have. Well, if people are going to leave the cave on their own, Plato's cave on their own, and not be dragged, it would seem to require some sort of persuadability. They have some sort of ability to persuade themselves to leave the cave on their own. They have the ability to be told there's an outside world and listen and believe it and go. Like, it's hard to imagine people leaving Plato's cave on their own or not relying on bestocentrism if they have no persuadability, no ability to change. It would also seem difficult to imagine intrinsic motivation or drive as a psychoanalytical term, without some kind of persuadability, some sort of capacity of oneself to persuade yourself that you can do something or that something is worth doing. All of this suggests an ability and persuadability. That persuadability is not merely a weakness or a form of manipulation. And if we think of it that way, and we think of the question of spreading childhood to deal with, to address the problems of belonging again in explanation part 1, then there is a certain ability that has to spread, a certain capacity to be persuaded, to persuade oneself to change, to be altered, and to talk about the spread of childhood, which is also tied to the capacity to create values, to operate according to groundlessness, to not need certainty, all of these other principles. To be dialectical. A dialectical thinker is a big part of that. Well, if you're not already a child, for some lucky reason, then to become one, that by definition requires a persuadability to some degree. And so if we're going to talk about spreading childhood, we have to talk about giving people the ability to change in that way. And that, that gets tied to the question of freeing speech and what are the aesthetics in a sociological sense that people subconsciously organize their values, and so on and so forth. And so then the book will go from there. Again, our Parallax course will be starting on Sunday. We would love to have you join. You can sign up for it in the description. You can sign up for it at Parallax, the website. Michelle and I really enjoyed the Look to the Bird to the Air class, and we're looking forward to doing it again. And for more about from Belonging Again II.1, please check it out on Amazon. You can find a playlist on YouTube that covers the material. And thank you so much for your time.